So a number of years ago, my family and I visited California, Southern California, where I grew up, and we were visiting this beautiful little botanical garden that had, all these pretty trees, and in one part it had this nice little green lawn with some beautiful trees and a pond nearby, and there were all these cute little ducks walking around. And Juliet wasn't yet born, but Ben was, I'd say, 1.5 or 2, just a little guy, and he was so excited. He was chasing around the ducks and having a great time. And we were excited because my uncle and aunt and their kids were going to visit. We didn't get to see them too many times, but too often, because we live far away. But they were going to visit us, so we were waiting for them to visit, having this beautiful time. And sometimes you expect this wonderful thing to happen, and then things go downhill pretty quickly. So we were sitting there by the ducks in the pond, and little Ben was walking along. He was kind of a toddler, and he started looking at the water, and pretty soon fell in the water, splash, just a little guy. And, being a dad, I was like, I'm going to save my son. And it wasn't too deep anyway, maybe only this deep, but he was little too. So I went in there, excited to save him with a little too much zeal, not realizing the reason he slipped was that it was extremely slippery under the water. And so I start walking up there, and I'm like, and I immediately fall. Ben's actually on his way up as I fall down, and instead of helping him up, I knock him back down, poor kid, back into the water. And so I get up, and poor little Ben's crying, and I pick him up, and we finally both get out of the water, and we assess what's happening. Of course, he's completely wet and covered with mud, and so am I. And I also empty my pockets, and of course my wallet's soaked too, so I put it down. And we have this quick conversation, Steph and I, about, do we have any spare clothes? Spare clothes for me, of course not. Spare clothes for Ben. No, we didn't bring any. Okay, I said, well, I'm going to get in the rental car. Leave him here because, we don't want to get it too muddy. I'll go to our hotel, get our clothes, and come back. So that's what I do. I jump in the car. Hopefully, in about 15 minutes I could be there and then be back. As I start driving, I'm going, and I look at the gas. And the gas light has just popped on, and I have a ways to go. So I keep on driving, and eventually I'm starting to hear, and I'm like, so I need to go to a gas station. So I pull over, get into a gas station, feeling good. At least I'll get some gas. Reach in my pocket. I had taken out my wallet and left it to dry at this place. And suddenly here I was, covered with mud, looking ridiculous with no money in my pocket and needing at least a few bucks of gas. And what was I going to do? Well, I'll tell you what happens at the end of the story. But sometimes this happens in life where we expect we're heading into a happy, joyous occasion only for things to go horribly wrong. And that's kind of what the gospel story feels like today. Here we are in the church and in society in this Christmas season, and we've just gotten through kind of the happiest picture of the Bible, right? The baby Jesus born in this cute scene of animals and angels singing and shepherds. Everything seems so happy, and now we're in the next week of Christmas, and we expect it's going to be happy, and then suddenly this horrible story about Herod ordering the slaughter of innocents hits us like a brick wall, and it's like, oh my gosh, what happened to happy Christmas, right? This isn't really what we want to be doing in the Christmas season. I was thinking about what I'm going to do with the sermons this week, and I was talking to some of my pastor friends, asking them, so what are you doing with your sermon this week? See if I could get a few ideas. And of course, they were all smarter than me. Most of them said, we're doing a hymn sing. I'm not preaching. So they know what's going on, and I'll keep that in mind for next year, Jeremiah. But none of us really want to go here in this time. But we can forgive those who organized the readings a long time ago, the lectionary, on why this reading comes, because it literally comes after the Magi, as Julie shared. This is the next thing that happens in the story. And also we'll forgive it because obviously the Bible wants to say something from this story. It has something to teach us. So I'd like to think with you today about how this weird pattern of a wonderful birth followed by a horrific event can teach us something in our faith. And I want to begin by introducing you a little more to the villain of this story, who is, of course, course, King Herod. If you were talking to a historian, you would learn, and it took me years to realize this, there's actually two King Herods in the New Testament. There's the King Herod the first, the father, and then his son. As we hear in this story, he dies when Jesus is a child, and then the next Herod comes in. The Herod we're talking about in this story, the first one, is known by historians as Herod the Great. Herod the Great was an extremely ambitious ruler who wanted to achieve as much power and prestige for himself, and a little bit for his country, but mainly for himself as possible. You may remember from previous times in church that at this time, Israel, which was called Judea, was not an independent kingdom. It was a puppet kingdom to the Empire of Rome, who were the real rulers. So Herod was kind of this puppet kingdom who got to rule in their place and keep control. He liked to make friends with the Romans. He wanted them to like him so he could be more powerful. He taxed his people heavily and sent a lot of money back to the Romans, so the Romans liked him. And he was known for pursuing these huge, colossal building projects. So like he was the one who rebuilt the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Jerusalem was. The Wailing Wall, which is the only part of the temple still there, was built during his time. He built a new port so that ships could come in. He built a number of castles because he was paranoid about people overthrowing his rule. So there's this famous one in Israel called Masada, which was built by King Herod the First. And so he was, this big character, but he was also hated by his own people. He was hated because he mixed his religion with the Romans. He was hated because he taxed people heavily to build these huge things. And he was hated especially because he was this incredibly brutal, paranoid, egomaniac of a ruler. In fact, even beyond this story that we heard today of a horrific order, there are lots of stories in the historical record about things he did that were just unbelievable. If he ever suspected that another noble family was even hinting at overshadowing him or threatening his rule, he was known to wipe out entire families. I mean, just, from old to young, didn't tolerate anyone getting in the way of his rule. During his reign, he ordered the execution of one of his wives and 3 of his own children, again, because he was worried they were scheming against him. And when he was about to die, and this is maybe the craziest one, he had put in his will that soldiers were to round up about 300 of the leaders of Israel and have them executed in the theater, because he was afraid, since he was hated, that no one would lament his death, and he wanted to make sure people would lament it. Luckily, after he died, everyone figured out they don't have to follow his instructions anymore, so they didn't follow this particular command. But all of this is to say that when the Bible records that he had children under 2 wiped out because he was threatened by this story of a Messiah, a new king of Israel, this is entirely believable, right? This was who he was and what he did as a leader whenever he felt threatened in his rule. And as you can imagine, hearing these rumors of the people excited by the coming of the Messiah, and then being told there's a Messiah who's been born in Bethlehem, how paranoid and angry this must have made him. And so, of course, we hear this horrible story of what he ordered, and then we hear about how Jesus' family is forced to flee their homeland and take refuge in Egypt for the first few years of Jesus' life, which is kind of ironic, right? Because the story of Israel is they fled from Egypt to take refuge. Now they're fleeing back to Egypt. Eventually, King Herod dies, it says. His son, the new King Herod, comes about, and they say they're less worried about being in danger, so they go back to Israel, but they're still worried. This new King Herod isn't a nice guy either. So instead of settling in Bethlehem, where they had been, they go to Nazareth, which is in Galilee. And Galilee is like this little boondock kind of outskirts outside of Jerusalem where no one's going to notice them. So that's why they end up living in Nazareth. So that's kind of the narrative we get in this story. But I think, obviously, the big question is, what does this have to teach us, right? Why is this horrible story in Scriptures? So there are 3 lessons I'd like to draw from it with you today. The first is that this story is a warning to us that sometimes evil is threatened by grace. We don't have to like that truth, but it simply is true, right? That sometimes God's acts of grace are exactly what people are against when people are against those kinds of things. And one of the things we find in the New Testament, in this story and in Jesus' teachings, is he's constantly kind of giving his disciples expectations that, faith isn't always going to be easy. Sometimes following Jesus is going to involve meeting opposition in the world. And we can see this dynamic in the way that the story contrasts these two different kinds of kings, right? On the one hand, we have the Son of God, the true king from heaven, right? Jesus, who is the true and rightful newborn king of the Jews, who has come to the world peacefully and humbly. And he wants to rule for the sake of others and in this way of love. And on the other hand, we have the earthly, evil King Herod, who is paranoid, who is bloodthirsty, who's an egomaniac, who thinks nothing about throwing people away for the sake of his own lust for power. And if we keep reading the Gospels and remember some of these stories, what we'll see is that the rest of Jesus' life, along with being a beautiful ministry, was also a continuous confrontation with how Jesus defines who God is and God's rule, which is all about love and forgiveness and inclusion with all kinds of people. And then how the powers that be defined what it meant to rule, right? Which was all about power and revenge and choosing winners and losers and in-groups and out-groups. And if we look at the world, certainly today and certainly through history, not much has changed, has it? Right? We still find plenty of examples of human power working against the things that bring healing to this world. Thinking of our own country, why is it that we live in a society where people can work 2 jobs and still not afford to live, right? That's a justice issue. Why is it that people of color get longer prison sentences for the same crimes as people not of color? Why is it that college students nowadays sometimes have to take out tens of thousands of dollars of debt that they can never write off when education used to be affordable? Why is it that kids go to school or go to bed hungry in our own country, even though we're the richest country ever, right? We still live in a world that exercises power in unhealthy ways. And this kind of brings us to the second lesson we can draw from this story, which is that part of the job of being a Christian is to remember which of these kings is our king. Right? Which one do we follow? Because, all of us actually have some power in our life. Some have more than others, no doubt. But all of us have at least some power, right? We have a voice that we can speak. We have resources and talents. We have relationships with people in our community, in our family. Heck, in this country, we have a vote, which is more than most people had throughout history. And then whatever vocation you find yourself in, if you're a parent, if you're a friend, if you're an accountant or a janitor or whatever, you have the power in that capacity to build things up in a good way or to break things down in a bad way. So I think part of what this story asks us is, how are we using these things? Do we use them to look after number one, like, a Herod of the world would tell us to do? Or do we see the bigger picture? The picture that Jesus saw, where he talked about how all people are loved and valued, where no people get to be thrown away. Do we remember who we are as Christian peoples? Some of you may know that Stephanie and I got to spend a year of service in Egypt. One of the things we really loved doing there was getting to know the Christian community in Egypt, which is a very old one that goes back almost to the beginning. And Christians there are called Coptic Christians. And one of the interesting things was that even though they had been oppressed for 1,000 years, Christians there had a very strong identity, despite that it was hard to be Christian. One of the things that was remarkable about them was that most Coptic Christians we knew had this little simple 2-line cross on their wrist. And so in other words, they had this constant reminder of who they were, even though they lived in a place where being reminded of who they were might make them in danger, right? Might put them in danger. So that was one thing, the cross on their wrist. The other thing that struck us was when you went to a Coptic church, many of them very old, beautiful old churches, they were always shaped like an ark, like Noah's Ark. And I think the symbolism was intentional, right? Life is hard. We face some oppression, but in this place, we feel the safety of God's love. And so, it's about remembering who we are as Christians, remembering that we're called to live life differently, even though living differently might be difficult. And so Christian life is partially about this responsibility of remembering who we are and living differently. But I also want to say it's about hope that goes beyond even us. One of the big dramatic questions of this story is which king is going to win, right? Is Herod going to be able to quash God's plan literally in its infancy and wipe out the baby Jesus? And you know what? As we all know, the answer is a resounding no. And that's the third lesson of this, that in the end, God's love wins, right? In fact, Matthew wants to show that even though we have this pretender king, Herod, who thinks he's in charge and thinks he can thwart God's plan and can cause a lot of damage in the short term, in the end, God's plan will not be undone. In fact, every move Jesus' family make in this story actually has significance in Scripture, where Matthew wants to tie it to God's plan that we see in the Old Testament. For instance, they start in Bethlehem, and he quotes something from Micah 5:2 that says, "But you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." So you have Bethlehem, and then you have the flight to Egypt, right? And that comes the quote from Hosea 11:1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And then eventually the story goes where they go to Galilee, and he quotes then from Isaiah 9:1, which says, "But in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light." Right? So Matthew's making these connections to show us that even though there's lots of destruction, even though there's bad things happening, God has a plan with this Christ child. And no one is going to be able to stop it. And Jesus is going to save the world, whether we like it or not, whether Herod likes it or not. And Jesus is going to overcome all evil with or without our help. And that's the beautiful promise of Christmas. But when we think about God who wants to have a plan that's going to succeed, whether we like it or not, one thing we might ask is, well, if God's going to do what God's going to do with or without us, then why does it matter what we do, whether we believe, whether we participate? Luther actually looked at this question when he wrote the Small Catechism, and he wrote about the Lord's Prayer. And in the Lord's Prayer, there's these things we say like, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," or "Give us today our daily bread." And in each of these things, he asks the question, well, won't these things probably happen without our praying? And he says, yeah, they will. But we pray that not just that they would happen, but that we would be part of them happening. That we would be the ones to celebrate it and help it happen. That we are part of what God is doing. And that's what we believe in Christians, that at the end of the day, grace is going to shine through, whether we do something or not. But God's grace shows up best when we're willing to do our part to make it real. Coming back to the story I shared at the beginning, I was at that gas station covered in mud, humiliated, wondering what I'm going to do, and I realized I had nothing to do but to humble myself and literally beg for money for someone to buy me a little gas. And so I think the second person I asked, I'm sorry, but I need some money. I was at the pond and I fell in this ridiculous story, and he's just kind of looking at me like, what's wrong with this guy? But he looks at me and eventually says, yeah, I'll buy you some gas, and ran his card through, and I was, thank you so much. If you give me your number, I'll pay you back. And he's like, nah, don't worry about it. And it may, in the long run, be a small thing of kindness, but at that moment, it was such grace. And that was God's grace shining through a random guy at a gas station. And it's just a random reminder that God's grace can shine through all of us too, that God has a plan and that we can be part of it when we offer grace to others. Amen.